Today, were new laws to blame for coronation arrests? Is the government getting too close to China? And what did Brexit do to the Tory party? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Henry Smith, Labour MP Barry Gardiner, former Liberal Democrat advisor who now works at the University of the Arts, London, Polly Mackenzie, and director of the centre-right think tank Onward, Sebastian Payne. Today.
Clearly something has gone wrong in this case. There were 6 people who were arrested and detained and prevented from taking part.
Of course, people have the right to protest freely but peacefully, but it is also right that people have the ability to go about their day-to-day lives without facing serious disruption.
Police express regret over coronation arrests. Were new protest laws to blame? Chinese Vice President Han Tsung attends the coronation. Now a trade minister is sent to Hong Kong. Are the government going soft on China?
We will prosper and flourish and thrive as never before if we leave the European Union on June the 23rd and take back control.
5 Conservative Prime Ministers later, what has Brexit done to their party? Let's start with this headline story in The Guardian. Pharmacies in England to offer prescriptions for 7 conditions amid surgery crisis. Yes, they will be allowed to prescribe antibiotics and antivirals for common illnesses like ear infections under plans to free up, the government says, nearly 30,000 GP appointments a day. So my opening question to the panel is, will these new measures mean the end of the 8 a.m. scramble to secure a GP appointment? Henry?
Well, having done the 8 a.m. scramble last week to get a GP appointment, we do need some pragmatic measures to help free up the pressure on GPs. Obviously, we're still recovering from the impact of the COVID pandemic, and I think that by investing, I understand it's £240 million in new apps and phone systems to make it easier to get appointments, and
also more than that, actually, over the next 2 years.
And also to allow pharmacies to prescribe for some of those most common ailments, I think is a common sense, sensible way forward that will certainly help, I think, free up GP access.
Right, but might not stop that 8 a.m. scramble. Do you think it will? Do you think it'll mean the end of that rush to get a GP appointment first thing in the morning?
Look, I welcome pharmacies taking on more. Community pharmacies have done a phenomenal job during COVID. They actually delivered 22 million vaccinations. There's only 11,000 community pharmacies, and actually over the past 7 years, since 2015, 700 have been lost. So the government has not invested in community pharmacies, and actually, if you look at what's happened, the payment, the contract that community pharmacists have with the government, first of all, it was cut before 2015, then it was frozen, and now the latest announcement says that it's going to be frozen for a further 2 years. Now, you cannot ask people to take on more work and not give them more reward in the way that the government is doing. I think they do a phenomenal job. They're the front line of defence in primary care. They often are they deal with about 80% of the people that come through the door, and they then refer that 20% onto GPs as is appropriate.
Do you think it'll work, this idea of trying to free up all those tens of thousands of GP appointments a day, the government says, on the basis that pharmacists can prescribe antibiotics, or drawing up plans for increased numbers of people doing self-referrals for services such as physiotherapy?
You know, the unity between Henry and Barry shows this is a broadly sensible thing to do. It probably will make a difference at the margin, assuming that the funding for the pharmacies is got right. But what worries me is that this is another set of reforms looking at the efficiency of how we process people through the system, and that's good, But actually, real public health comes from thinking about how do you prevent people or reduce the chances of them presenting to the system. Do you look at the kind of the mess of our food system? Do you look at financial difficulties and the triggers they cause for mental health problems? Do you look at stopping people smoking, getting them switched to vaping, which is 95% less harmful?
I mean, they're longer term, aren't they?
They are longer term, but actually, because, actually people who lose 10 kilos can have massively reduced kind of pain from things like arthritis, reduced chance of heart conditions, reduced blood pressure, reduced monitoring. So actually, I kind of get Britain healthy. It doesn't help with next Monday's GP appointments. But it's actually the only way to reduce the burden on the health system. If you just continue trying to inflate the health system to cope with more and more need, you're always going to be chasing your tail. You're always going to run out of money and run out of nurses and run out of doctors. You need to actually aim for a healthier society instead.
In the meantime, with those longer-term trends that Polly is talking about, Seb, it was one of the issues, anecdotally, that came up on the doorstep and during canvassing, according to a lot of council leaders, particularly outgoing Conservative ones, saying, I can't get a GP appointment. I mean, so retail-wise, I suppose it will appeal, but will it work?
Well, I think there's lots of evidence from other Western countries that it will actually work, that Britain is quite rare in the role that its pharmacies play in the healthcare service, having lesser provision. And as Barry said, during the pandemic, it was shown that they can step up and do more when more is asked of them. When you're facing the kind of challenge in the health service, yes, absolutely, it should work. But you're right, Joe, that my think tank Onward has done some research and called After the Fall, and we saw that the NHS is pretty much very near the top of all voters' priorities, whether they're Labour voters, Conservative voters, and it speaks to not just their daily lives and their access to healthcare, but how they feel about society. And I do think we've got to think about these smart ways of delivering services. Polly's obviously right that there are these medium, longer-term trends that are important, but right now, people just do want to see a health service that is working better, and I think we do have to be more creative about this. And if the Conservatives want to not see what happened last week happen again in the future, that is a tangible, clear improvement in the service they're getting from the NHS.
But you can't get a tangible, clear improvement if at the same time pharmacists are experiencing a 25% real terms cut in the value of their contract. So, I heard the Prime Minister earlier this morning on TV saying, we're investing more in pharmacies. No, you're not. You've just concluded a contract that says for the next 2 years, it will be absolutely flatlined.
Well, let Henry respond to that.
And yet inflation is eating in to that contract.
Of course, Barry, and you know the reason why that is, which is that if you give inflation-busting pay rises, that's going to make inflation more sustained. There have got to be difficult balances made here with the state of the economy and the demands on the health service.
Yes, very, very, very surprising that it's always the people at the bottom of the scale that are told that they're causing inflation. It's never the people who are the top.
Well, Henry, you respond just briefly on this idea that pharmacists are going to be expected to do more with less.
Well, there is record amounts of funding going into the National Health Service, and that's why it's important that actually there's a broad basket of measures. Prevention, as we were hearing about just a few moments ago, focus on that. I think certainly focus on supporting pharmacists to help people with those ailments that arguably, in most parts, should never reach the GP surgery. I think it's a whole range of measures that needs to be introduced that make sure that we have a health system that is reformed and affordable.
All right, let's talk about the arrests that were made ahead of the coronation, because less than a week on from the new Public Order Act, which we talked about last week coming into force, we've already seen the Metropolitan Police saying it regrets using those or some of those new powers. And that is, of course, following the row after the arrest of half a dozen activists from the Republic campaign group for possession of what the police thought was suspected lock-on devices. Now, they've all been released without charge. And the leader of the group, Graham Smith, is saying he's now considering legal action. Let's have a listen.
I think they really got tied up in knots trying to work out how they're going to detain us and on what charge. And I think that is alarming in itself because, they effectively went out of their way to detain peaceful protesters and stop them from peacefully protesting. And we essentially are in a situation where you no longer have the right to peacefully protest. You only have the freedom, which is contingent on their permission. And I think that is an alarming situation to be in a democratic society.
Graham Smith there, the Republic leader. Were the Metropolitan Police's actions right or wrong, Henry?
I wasn't there. I don't know what the parameters were where they decided to arrest these individuals or not.
Well,
I do
Henry,
think it's right.
I can take you through what happened again. But a group of people, including Graham Smith, were arrested by the Metropolitan Police because they thought they had evidence that they might have devices for locking on. They discovered that there wasn't that evidence, and they've been released. And the Metropolitan Police have said they regret the arrests in the first place. They were using the laws, new laws that were brought in a hurry ahead of the coronation because people didn't want anything disrupted. Were they right or were they wrong?
So I've heard the media reports myself, obviously, as to what happened. It was an operational decision that was made by the Metropolitan Police. Clearly, they saying that was the wrong decision that they made. People do have an important right to protest and to express their opinions. But I think the broader question that you're asking here is this new legislation right?
Well, we'll come on to that. We'll come on to that in just a moment. Okay. But at the moment, you say it's an operational decision. That's what Rishi Sunak said. But of course, those powers were brought in ahead of time. They were supposed to come in a few months' time by the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. Were the Metropolitan Police's actions right or wrong?
They were wrong, and they've acknowledged that they were wrong. They've said, look, we got it wrong. And thank goodness they have said that. But I have to point out that this is what we in the Labour Party said would happen when this legislation was brought in. We said it can be used by the police to do what they think the government might want. Now, I had a wonderful time at the weekend with all the celebrations. It was great. But I also think one of the great things about this country is that we respect people's freedom to protest, people's freedom to have a different point of view to us. And the fact that somebody who had actually been in touch with the police about how their protest could go off well and be properly managed, and they'd had those discussions beforehand, that the police then should have arrested them, I think is appalling.
Henry?
Well, I think the Metropolitan Police have admitted that they got the operational decision wrong, but I don't think it changes the fact that these new measures are important. They were brought in because we need to balance the right of people's right to protest, but also the right of other people to go about their lives. And they were brought in because there were reports last year of ambulances not being able to get to hospital because of protests.
From going about their lives.
Well, the Docklands Light Railway was disrupted. Was it last year, the year before? Bizarrely, by Just Stop Oil. And that is actually impinging on other people's right to go about their lives.
So that implies it's the laws rather than the operational.
I think it's right that the law was updated that protects a right of protest and protects a right of free speech, but also protects the rights of other people to go about their business.
Right. Isn't it, though, then, the new laws rather than the operational issues causing the problem in this particular instance?
Yeah, I think the laws have pushed us to become somewhat imbalanced in terms of our approach to freedom of speech. The government is also legislating to require universities like my own to take freedom of speech more seriously and to make sure that a university campus is a place where freedom of speech is expansively supported as the contest of ideas. And I'd like to see that same approach taken to protest. Some of the conversation around this has been, well, sure, maybe it was a bit heavy-handed, but if they'd disrupted, that people would have been upset about that too. And that's, I think, a bit misguided. Who do you care about? Actually, the right of protest against power is more important than the right of powerful people. And we're talking about, an important celebration for our nation, for me, for Barry. But nevertheless, for that to be, for powerful people's interests to not be offended, not be mildly irritated by a banner that just said, "Not my king." There was a protest. We saw some of those banners in the crowd, and I think that is good. But that group of protesters, including the leader of Republic, wasn't allowed to join. And it does feel to me like the government has just pushed a little bit too far, which is odd, considering that in other arenas, They are so adamant
pushing the
about
other
freedom
way.
of speech.
I mean, there is noisy protest, because there were fears, I think, about big, loud noise perhaps disrupting or distracting the horses, for example, and so on and so forth.
No, I think this is an operational issue. It's not about the laws, because the fact is that the laws that were introduced were for very particular kinds of direct protesting, who are disrupting and doing unsafe protest, walking down the A1, gluing themselves to road railings, creating a very clear issue there that had to be tackled. What the Met did was mess this up by using that to tackle people who were not engaging in that kind of protesting. And Republic, the group in question, have a long history of protesting against the monarchy, not in the means that you see Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil, who these laws were created to do. So I do think it's an operational misstep by the Met. But on the other hand, there were hundreds of peaceful protesters that we don't hear about across the Coronation weekend. And I think you've got to get into a very careful situation of not trying to judge every single operational decision, because overwhelmingly this weekend was a great success. I think the Coronation went off magnificently, and the Met did a very good job at maintaining order. They messed up on this, but I think that's operational, not about the laws.
I mean, does Labour have any plans, it certainly doesn't sound like it, to repeal these laws? I mean, if you win the next election, you could reverse them.
Well, I'm not in the shadow cabinet, so I can't tell you is the answer, Jo.
No, but what would you do?
Look, we opposed these laws when they came in.
I know.
I absolutely accept what Seb was saying. I think the Met did get it wrong here, and on the whole, the weekend passed off well, and it was well policed. It was here that there was a problem. But I think the problem came because there has been a push from government through the Public Order Act, through other legislation, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, all the way in which really authoritarian legislation has been introduced, and that pushes the police to think we're being expected to do something that we may not be comfortable with. And the power dynamic that Polly talked about, you know, who do we need to protect in society? We need to protect those who don't have a voice, but who want to make themselves heard. Not the people who have the power, not the people who actually have every opportunity to get their voice heard.
Although, does Republic not have a voice?
Yeah, but the reason the government passed these laws, Barry, is because of the things that Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion were doing, which, as I said, I'm sure you would agree, many of them were unsafe and were not in the normal forms of protesting, people exercising their democratic right there. So I don't think it was the government seeking authoritarian powers. It was responding to how people were acting.
What about the part of the legislation that said if it was noisy to such an extent that somebody might be disturbed by it?
Well, you obviously know that if the example of this weekend, what the Met thought had happened were alarms being used, which could have frightened horses, which could have created unsafe and disruptive.
Seb, let's be clear. Those horses have trumpets on them. They have drums on them. The idea that loud noises are going to frighten those horses is really not credible, is it?
But I think it was one of the things that was under discussion. I mean, if you feel very strongly about it, do you think Labour should go for wholesale repeal of this particular piece of legislation? Lisa Nandu, who is in the shadow cabinet, couldn't commit to that.
Well, look, I believe that we need to strike a balance between allowing people to get on with their everyday life and to make sure that protest is safe. But at the same time, I think the balance must be in favour of those who want to protest against authority, not in favour of authority shutting them up.
Well,
and for that reason, I think it would be good for a future Labour government to look at this legislation again and to say, OK, how do we get that balance right? Because at the moment, I don't think it is.
Do you agree it isn't right? I mean, Polly was saying perhaps you have gone too far the other way.
I think the balance is right, because it is unacceptable that you can have major pieces of transport infrastructure that are effectively closed down for many hours at a time, causing huge disruption to people's lives, putting people's lives at risk, and also doing huge damage to the economy. Standing with a placard and protesting absolutely is an ancient right in this country. We see it just half a mile down the road outside Parliament every single day. and that is protected. But what isn't acceptable is disruption that does affect other people's rights, and therefore I do think the balance of the law, as recently passed, is about right.
We're expecting an urgent question, as we call it, in the House of Commons this afternoon over the particular issue of the arrests made by the Metropolitan Police ahead of or leading into the coronation. We're going to talk about the UK's relationship to China. This headline in the Daily Mail: Tory MPs fury as Trade Minister Dominic Johnson holds talks on renewing Britain's business ties with Hong Kong in first visit to the city since China's crackdown on civil rights. There is certainly a lot of discomfort also following James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary's speech earlier this month, in which he called for a constructive but robust relationship with China. Luke de Pulford of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China described Lord Johnson's visit, this is the Trade Minister, as another body blow to MPs on all sides of the House of Commons who have spent a lot of time and energy to raise awareness about Beijing's human rights abuses. You can see the headline in BBC News about James Cleverly. Do you agree with Luke de Pulford from the group?
I think there's a litany of human rights abuses that the Beijing regime is responsible for, whether that be going against pro-democracy campaigners in Hong Kong, whether that be against the Uyghur in Xinjiang province, whether that be saber-rattling against Taiwan. China wants all the benefits of being part of the global system, but doesn't want, it seems, to be responsible in terms of how a country should act when it comes
to human rights. So should the Trade Minister have gone to Hong Kong?
I'm concerned about that. There is, however, as James Cleverly, Foreign Secretary, has said, we need to strike a balance. You know, China is a reality. It's a huge part of the global economy. It's not going anywhere. So I think what is right is that we have a realistic relationship about China. The United States has a very similar position, and that's why I think it's right that we have initiated the new AUKUS alliance with Australia and the United States against the threats that China is facing. So we have to have a relationship with China, but we shouldn't be naive about the way they behave.
Right, but can you, at the same time, embrace or engage with China on business matters, because that is to the UK's commercial financial interests, and also say that we're going to have a distance from China because of human rights abuses? You can't do both, surely.
Well, I think China is a reality in the global marketplace, and the European Union has recently had several missions to China.
And were they wrong?
The United States as well. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, has been talking about this, striking this balance as well. Australia, a country that has very difficult recent history with China, nevertheless has a degree of relationship. And I think what we need to see more of are the global democracies coming together to say that China, if it wants to be part of the global system, needs to abide by those global rules and norms.
What should the approach be?
Henry talks about the relations that the United States has with China in trade. But this government, in fact, when Liz Truss was the trade minister, immediately we were able to ensure that we cut the punitive tariffs that were there in the European Union against Chinese steel that was being dumped in this country. At that time, I spoke up and said, because I was the shadow trade minister at that stage, and I said, this is absolutely wrong. We need to impose these punitive tariffs on China. The US put on a 220% punitive tariff on the Chinese steel that was dumped in the US. Yes, let's have an acceptance of the reality that China is a major player in international trade and major player in, on the global stage. But let's make sure that we are protecting our interests, that we are standing up for our steel industry and other industries in this country.
In terms of the human rights abuses, the group that Henry is part of are saying that actually we can't do this. We cannot, on the one hand, be engaging with them on the sorts of issues you've talked about, and on the other saying they're a threat.
Well, I was doing the Democracy Forum discussion just 2 weeks ago, in which we are talking about the way in which we've had 70 years of Tibet being governed by China. And the one issue that Henry didn't talk about, and I agree with all the ones that he did, was that you have a 2,200-mile border with India, Arunachal Pradesh, recent violence on that border, and at the other end of the western end of the Himalayan border, you had people being literally clubbed to death, 20 Indian soldiers clubbed to death, because they don't use guns on that border. There's an agreement not to fire across the border.
But then it's still not clear what
they're still fighting.
Yeah, but it's very
sticks.
difficult. Then what should the relationship be? What should the UK's relationship be to China?
I think on the one hand, you've got to have an element of pragmatism. As Henry said, China is not going away. We can't just close our eyes and pretend it doesn't exist as a major player, economic and trading partner. But on the other hand, I do think we've got to be robust, and we haven't been robust enough on the values element of this. And we went through the golden handshake era under David Cameron's
rolling out
government.
the red carpet.
When, yes, exactly, nice cosy pints in Oxfordshire pubs. You know, we can't have that because I think it's not acceptable given
And
the
is
way
that
China
what this
has
is?
changed. I don't think that's what this is, though. Like, as I said, you know, I remember at the G7 summit last year in Bali, there was discussions that the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was going to meet with President Xi Jinping. It didn't happen in the end, but there was a bit of a backlash for that. And I think it's ridiculous to say the Prime Minister can't meet the Chinese Premier. And I think it's silly to say that they should not engage with China on an economic basis. But as with all realpolitik, you've got to have a clear head on where your lines are and where your values are and where you're calling things out. And I think the meetings, the diplomatic meetings that took place over the Coronation weekend, we've heard from various reports that the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, did call out these issues that you were both talking about with the representative from China. And it is uncomfortable. It is not easy, but that is geopolitics.
I mean, there have been rows over the sorts of language that has been undertaken by the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister. I think the groups of Tory MPs particularly who wanted to hear politicians saying that China is the greatest threat we face, that actually China is perhaps our potentially greatest foe, but actually that's not the language that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary either rightly or wrongly used. They were talking about the greatest challenge and that we had to have a robust relationship. I mean, does it matter that the language is used, or what language is used by politicians? In the end, isn't it what happens when these two countries meet?
I think it matters enormously. I think most of us would like what Henry has described at the beginning, which was we would like China to be involved in the economic system to the benefit of all global economics, but also to abide by the rules of the global system. But a pathway from where we are to that is enormously difficult, enormously uncertain. And it might feel virtuous in the immediate to say something like China is our greatest economic opportunity or China is the greatest threat that we feel. But actually, neither of those things probably gets you very far because it probably closes down your ability to make progress. I mean, you need to stay in the room if you want to be able to have the difficult conversations. And the reality is that calling China a threat pushes you out of the room. It harms our economy. It harms Chinese people. It also reduces our chance to build cultural links, soft power links, and to stand up for those human rights issues. This is as difficult as foreign policy gets, right? Like, I desperately would love to have a simple answer, a thing we could do, a stance we could take that would lead to greater protection for the Uyghur people or on the Chinese-Indian border. But it is incredibly difficult. China has immense power across the world. It is systematically built up over a generation, and we cannot ignore that. But we have to leverage our power to maximise the chances of change, which best chance of that is actually change from within China, not from us.
Let me just show you this in The Independent, so we'll come to you. Liz Truss to visit Taiwan to show solidarity in face of China threats. Is this the sort of thing that is going to be helpful? Because you know how the Chinese responded, of course, when the American US Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, went there. They reacted very badly.
No, well, I was following up what Polly was going to say. The biggest problem we have with our China policy is how often it's changed, that we've sort of oscillated from different things from one way to another. And we've gone from trying to pragmatically engage to name calling, and now we've gone back to pragmatic engagement. I mean, Liz Truss took a very hard line on China, much harder than the current government was. And I think
not when she was Trade Secretary.
Not when she was Prime Minister. This is very true, Barry. But I think
it was tactical, though.
It was,
and I'm sure this latest visit is also tactical about trying to support a particular nuance within the Conservative.
Of course, there will be
Party.
Conservative MPs who will see this and say, finally, she's saying what the government won't say. But ultimately, I don't think that gets you anywhere because we've just not had a clear vision.
We need a better China strategy. I'm on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and this is something that we have been pursuing. When Liz Truss was Foreign Secretary, I remember we questioned her, took evidence from her, and it was clear that the government didn't have a comprehensive China strategy. And that is really what we need to balance those things where, yes, there is a reality about global trade, but also there is a reality about extremely bad behaviour and human rights abuses from the regime in Beijing.
Do you think Ian Duncan-Smith, who has been a very strident critic, amongst others of your colleagues, to the way China behaves, do you think they go too far? Do you think they expect too much in terms of what government can do?
I'm much more in the Ian Duncan-Smith camp when it comes to China than I perhaps am in some others. And I think that we've had lots of statements and urgent questions in the House of Commons in recent weeks on Chinese police stations, for example, or on Chinese consul officials pulling people off the street of Manchester and beating them up when they were protesting. So I do think we need to be more robust when it comes to our China strategy.
I mean, Barry, has your approach or view changed? I mean, last year MI5 issued a warning about a Chinese agent, Christine Lee, regarding her interference in British politics on behalf of China. She'd contributed money to support your political work. She also had contact with senior Conservative politicians. Did that change your approach or view?
It's very interesting that Christine Lee has never been, she's not been arrested, she's not been charged with anything. And I think that sometimes these things are used by government to send a message to another power, and they don't actually have the basis on which to make the assertions that they do. But look, I have always been sceptical about the relations with China. I was sceptical when David Cameron and George Osborne were calling it a new golden age. What you have to understand, I suppose, is that we are talking about a third of the world's population, quarter to a third of the world's population being Chinese. They are a huge economic power. They have not, up until really the past 20 years, been a huge military power. But that military power has been developed. Right. And if you look at the strategy that they've adopted with the bases in the South Pacific, what they call the String of Pearls, with the new naval bases, they are building up a huge military resource. Now, I don't want to see the economic conflict that we have with China develop into a hot conflict with China. Nobody wants to see that.
All right.
The best way to do that is by talking, by negotiation, and by working our way through these common problems that we have about illegal dumping of and subsidies that form the trade agenda.
Let's leave it there for the moment, because we're going to talk about the Conservative Party and Brexit. In the headlines, you saw Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, he wasn't then, of course, campaigning in the EU referendum back in 2016. We're going to talk to Tim Bale, Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London. Hello to you, Tim, and author of a new book called The Conservative Party After Brexit, Turmoil and Transformation. Tim, how has Brexit changed the Conservative Party?
Well, it's ripped apart the fabric of the Conservative Party, I think. You could see the way that the ERG, the group that campaigned for us to leave the European Union and then to leave the European Union on a hard Brexit and then even to leave the European Union with no deal at all, actually held the Conservative Party's leadership under Theresa May to ransom and effectively, I think, levered Boris Johnson into number 10 with all the consequences that we have, if you like, enjoyed since then.
Do you agree with that assessment, Henry?
Look, Europe has been an issue for the Conservative Party and indeed British politics for over half a century. You know, there were these debates about joining the common market in the 60s and the early 70s, and then the Maastricht Treaty in the early 90s, all the way up to the EU referendum in 2016. Ironically, I think now there is much more of a stabilisation in the Conservative Party on the future future of European policy. Ironically, I think that's more of a challenge now for the Labour and Liberal Democrat parties, because what you have there is a position of the leadership saying they don't want to frighten the electorate by talking about going back into the European Union or the customs union or any of those aspects. But many of their members and their activists would like to see that. So I see more of a division developing on the EU in Labour and the Liberal Democrats
than I do
than
the Tories. Well, I'll come to you, Barry, in a moment. But Tim, do you want to respond to that?
I mean, I think it may be a problem for Labour if it becomes the government. I'm not so sure it's an electoral problem as much as has been suggested. I mean, we saw in the local elections, for example, I think probably a movement of people who had voted for Brexit and then subsequently voted for the Conservative Party in 2017 and especially in 2019 begin, if you like, to leave Brexit behind in the rearview mirror when it comes to making their political choices. So I'm not sure that it has as big an impact now as it did when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister.
Barry, what do you think about that? It's true, I agree with Tim. I was sitting here on Friday and you could see areas that voted to leave, you know, heavily, strongly, had moved back a bit. Some of them more than others, Stoke-on-Trent, for example, to Labour. Do you think Labour's in the right place on Brexit now and what it's saying to the electorate?
Can I just, first of all, take my hat off to Henry for what I thought was the best example of deflection politics that I've seen in a long time.
Oh, well, congratulations to you, Henry.
Thank you, Barry.
To be confronted with this is a cataclysmic problem for the Conservative Party and then to shunt it off to Polly and me and say, no, it's really a problem for the Liberal Democrats and for Labour. That was great. Look, is Labour in the right place? Labour's in the right place in saying the public made its decision. I don't think it was the right decision. We don't think it's the right decision. But they made their decision. If you are a democratic politician, you respect the public. And that's the point. Does it mean that you don't then try to forge new relationships, not go back into the old ones, but forge new relationships, which can mean that our trade is improved, because we've seen the value that the new trade deals have actually caused. New Zealand, a tiny fraction. Australia, a tiny fraction. All that we were promised from Brexit has not come about. So it's no wonder that some of the people who thought it was going to be a cure-all are actually thinking, well, actually, it didn't work out that way and are moving back to Labour.
Henry?
Well, to suggest that somehow the Labour Party have accepted the result of the referendum, I think, is a bit of a stretch. They spent 3.5 years in Parliament. I think Keir Starmer voted 43 times, something like that, against implementing the referendum result. I think what they have realised is that this is toxic after the 2019 election. And actually, I think what we're seeing amongst the electorate is returning to sort of real classic political issues such as cost of living, inflation, the NHS. I think that's what people are returning to, and very much agree that Brexit is increasingly in the rear view mirror.
Well, Tim, do you think, listening to both Barry and Henry discussing this issue, that it is still a problem potentially for all the main political parties, Brexit, that is?
Well, I think in as much as Brexit, as Barry said, doesn't seem to have delivered the goods for many people, yes, there will be a demand, obviously, on the part of some Europhiles, if you like, to get closer to the European Union and even to rejoin in the longer term. But I also think Henry's right to say that actually people are now thinking more about, if you like, the bread and butter issues, costs of living, the NHS. Unfortunately for Henry's party, I guess that's not necessarily a good thing because, they don't necessarily at the moment anyway play well for Rishi Sunak and the government.
Seb?
I think I've actually read Tim's book and it is absolutely brilliant and look at what's happened to the Conservative Party since Brexit. And, I think in years to come, we will look at kind of 2016 as a real inflection point where everything began to be reshaped. And my view is that there has been a realignment and that the Conservatives voting base up until 2016, if you look at the 2015 election, David Cameron took that coalition to its absolute maximum, winning seats like Battersea, for example, which things unthinkable today, which is a pretty strong Labour seat.
Yes,
And it's,
well, London is quite a Labour city.
Exactly that going back to the Conservatives. But what you saw after 2016 was bit by bit, all these seats in the country start to go away. This is the Red Wall, but it's also just generally across what you might call working class parts of England. So I think the Conservative Party was already going in that direction. Brexit sort of sped it up. And if you look at many other centre-right parties across other Western democracies, they've had a similar realignment, that their voting coalitions have changed quite a lot. And that's obviously adapted the party's outlook and its policies. But I think in some weird way, where we are at this moment, to go back to Henry's point, it's like economics is back in a way, that if you look at what voters care about, it's not necessarily the cultural issues of statues and free speech. It's about the NHS, it's about our things are growing. So even though the voting patterns have changed, what matters to voters is back to where it was before Brexit.
Polly, and I suppose we should also include the Liberal Democrats, who seem to have won right across what you might have called traditional Conservative areas, you know, across England, really, in those local elections on Friday.
Yeah, so just as we've seen this swing to Labour in those leave areas, it's areas with the highest number of graduates that have shifted away from the Conservatives. So the danger is that the Conservatives have realigned away from their old vote and away from their new vote. Which is going to be difficult for them in the next general election. The problem is that if you want to fix the NHS, what you need is freedom of movement for workers. And if you want to fix the economy, what you need is to rejoin the single market. And the reality is that Brexit is an extraordinary act of economic and social self-harm that we, as Barry says, people voted for it. We've got to live with it, probably for another 20 years. But it is a constant drag on our ability to thrive as a nation and a people. And until people are able, as political leaders, to accept that they enabled the people to inflict this act of economic self-harm, which is why we are poorer and why we are so unable to access the community of our neighbours, we won't actually be able to move forward.
I just don't accept that premise. I mean, okay. Barry was talking about tiny deals with New Zealand and Australia. The Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that was signed last month.
How much is that going to represent in terms of
significant opportunity. Well, it's many billions, and there have been 70 trade agreements around. Yes, I think the United Kingdom around the world. As well. And I think, actually, the economic woes that we see here are seen in Europe, are seen in North America as well. It's a result of the COVID pandemic.
Except, of course, they haven't had Brexit to whatever extent it's harmed the economy or not.
Food inflation in Germany is higher than it is in the UK.
Well,
and
let me just... We're talking about economics. You're saying that economics is at the forefront. And one aspect of it is housing. And that did come up rather a lot. In fact, Simon Clarke, former Cabinet Minister, says in The Telegraph, young people resent Tories over failure to build homes. Was it wrong, Henry, to drop the mandatory housing targets that had been in place until Rishi Sunak decided to scrap them on local authorities to build homes?
No, I don't think it was. I think that local people should be making decisions and locally elected individuals should be making decisions about planning. I think when you have overly draconian top-down targets, I actually think that actually creates far more resentment amongst people. People want housing for their children when they're young adults, but they want to be able to be in control of that process.
So, but Henry, since that target's been removed, I think we've seen the statistics that have shown house building has dropped. That you might be right in terms of giving the impetus to local people, but you do sometimes need top-down pressure, and we have got a housing crisis. The fact is, we do need to build more houses, and we need to pull every single lever we've got to build houses. And if that does require having some top-down targets, then so be it. It strikes me as if it was an error, and it's something that needs to be reversed. And fundamentally, we just need to build more houses. Right. We need to do it as quickly and as rapidly as possible.
But they need to be in the right place, and they need to have local consent.
Well, of course, people jobs and growth or anything inconvenient.
Tim, how different?
We really do need to look at everything, everywhere, all at once in terms of house building.
I'm sure that's a line from a song, isn't it, or something? No, a film. It's a film, isn't it, Joe? Tim, what about demographics? How difficult is it going to be for the Conservatives?
I mean, long term, they do face a problem. I mean, they're moving towards becoming what I've called a kind of ersatz populist radical right party, which means that they've got a lot of cultural policies which put a lot of young people off. And as Seb says, and as you've suggested, young people are also very frustrated about the housing situation. So in the long term, given that we are becoming a more socially liberal country and we have this housing crisis, I think the Conservatives are going to face a bit of a crunch in the next decade or so. Whether it will actually come in 2024 is another matter.
which is when, of course, we're expecting the next election. Well, it will be in 2024 at some point. Tim Bell, thank you very much for joining us. That's all for today. I'll be back tomorrow for Prime Minister's Questions. Thank you to all of my guests, of course. That will be on Politics Live tomorrow at 11:15 here on BBC Two and on BBC iPlayer. From all of us here, bye-bye.